You're watching live from Paris. I'm Sanam Chantier. It's 1:30 p.m. here in the French capital. A reminder of our top stories this hour. Former Catalan leader Carles Puigdemont hands himself in to Belgian authorities after Spain issued a new warrant for his arrest. Catalonia, meanwhile, braces itself for a fifth day of protests over the conviction of a dozen Catalan independence leaders. The EU and Britain reach a deal. Boris Johnson now begins an intensive campaign to garner support ahead of a Saturday vote by lawmakers in the UK. Also coming up this hour on Live from Paris, a 5-day ceasefire deal has been clinched in Turkey, and it's been hailed an incredible outcome by Donald Trump. But shelling and gunfire continue in Syria's Ras Al Ain this Friday. Thank you for watching France 24. This Friday, we start with Carles Puigdemont, who has handed himself over to Belgian authorities after a new arrest warrant was issued for the former Catalan leader in Spain. This comes as Catalonia braces itself for a fifth day of protests over the conviction of several independence leaders. As part of that movement, roads have been blocked, train services disrupted, and mass demonstrations held. In a fresh even challenge to Madrid following days of unrest, the head of the region's government has said that there should be a new vote on independence from Spain within 2 years. Nick Rushworth has more.
Separatist protesters in the early hours of Friday attempted to block the train station in Girona, north of Barcelona, near the border with France. It was the start of a day of disruption with a general strike across Catalonia and with protesters planning to converge on the Catalan capital. The Girona demonstration followed violence in Barcelona itself overnight, with police and separatists clashing. There have been 4 days of tension, dozens of people have been injured and an equal number arrested, after authorities sentenced former separatist leaders to up to 13 years in jail. The current Catalan president has called for calm, saying violence doesn't represent the independence movement. But he has also reiterated his calls to hold another referendum on independence before his term ends in 2022.
There will be a resolution to try to fix how we will achieve the right to Catalonian self-determination in the shortest time possible. This proposition will be debated by political parties, civil entities, and there will also be international participation.
Riot police on Thursday, meanwhile, intervened at a far-right pro-unity rally where a large crowd gathered to speak out against independence. The unrest has brought the Catalan issue centre stage once again in Spain. The central government has been criticised for its handling of the situation less than a month before a general election, the fourth in as many years.
Nick Rushworth there reporting. Now, it's been 3 years since Britain voted to leave the European Union, and on Thursday a Brexit agreement was finally drawn up between Boris Johnson and the EU, with both sides making concessions. However, the deal still needs approval by the UK's Parliament in a vote on Saturday. Meanwhile, some are pointing to pressure for the British Prime Minister to concede a second Brexit referendum. I'd now like to bring in Elvire Fabry, who's a senior research fellow at the Jacques Delors Institute. Thank you so much for being with us this Friday.
Hello.
Now, we know that both sides have made concessions to clinch this agreement, perhaps the biggest one coming from Boris Johnson.
The biggest one has been to accept that the border, to check how the goods would move from the British custom union, because the UK, one very key gain has been that the UK will keep his autonomy and his own custom union. But what Johnson has accepted was to move the border for those checks at the sea of the Northern Ireland, and this is an additional this is an additional issue for the DUP, the Unionists from Northern Ireland, because they have the perception that this is pushing Northern Ireland a little more closer to the Irish Republic.
And it's something that Johnson previously had said he wouldn't be doing, right?
Yes, but as we see, he had to make some concessions. His objective, even if he's been saying for weeks that he's prepared for no deal, and this is a political attitude, he needs to have this deal passed through the parliament, because his main goal are the elections in the coming weeks. And he can't go to the election with the negative impact of a no deal.
Absolutely, and you just mentioned this does need to go through the parliament, which will happen on Saturday in a vote. What if they don't pass? It's likely.
It's likely. It remains very likely. If it doesn't pass, Johnson has to comply with the ban bill obligation that he has to request an additional extension to the European Union. Will he be agreeing to that? Will he comply with that? And even if he requests that extension, will the Europeans agree to follow on that track?
The problem with an extension is someone like Jean-Claude Juncker ruled it out, even though he doesn't necessarily have the autonomy to reject that.
He intended to add some political pressure and really to close the option between deal or no deal. And in a way, I think it when just afterwards we could hear Donald Tusk mentioning that maybe the Europeans would have to consider the possibility of an extension was maybe a little mistake, because precisely as you say, Juncker is not in a position to talk in the name of the 27, but this was really a political message that was sent, that we have to move on and we have to keep really the discussion between deal and no deal.
Now, Elvire Fabry, another idea that's been floated around, and it has been from the outset, is the concept of a second referendum. How likely is that?
Well, what we know is that Johnson cannot count on the DUP votes, so he will have to dig in the Labour Party reserve, and notably the ones who have been writing to the European Commission saying that if there was a new deal on the table, they would support the deal. But can Johnson avoid really the request coming from the Labour Party to put an additional condition to the deal vote, which would be precisely to submit it to the public vote? And
I'm just going to interrupt you there because I have very little time left with one last question, a question that we're not hearing as much as perhaps we should. Should this deal pass, how economically positive is it? Will it fracture the European Union? Briefly, if you can.
Well, the whole question will be what will be the nature of the future relations, and will Johnson want to keep the UK in regulatory alignment with the EU, or will he opt for more divergence? And then that would mean that the friction would be stronger, because the Europeans would raise some more border frictions, and so the cost would be increased. But at least at the moment, Johnson is opting more for a very minor FTA with the EU, which will be quite costful for the British economy.
And of course, we'll keep speculating until we have some final results there. Elvire Fabry, Senior Research Fellow at Jacques Delors Institute. Thank you so much for your very insightful analysis here on France 24. Now, in other world news, it was a long day of negotiations for top US diplomat Mike Pence in Ankara. And a ceasefire deal was clinched on Thursday. This after a week of deadly clashes in northern Syria against Kurdish forces. The Turkish president, Recep Tayyip Erdogan, had previously said nothing anyone said could have stopped the offensive. Donald Trump, for his part, casting the truce as an example of his great deal-making during a rally in Dallas. Now, caught in that crossfire are Kurdish residents in the area. Thousands of them have fled in vehicles and by foot with few possessions to seek safety in Iraqi refugee camps. Some of them are escaping from the bombardment, while others are fleeing conscription. Here's Simon Harding with that story.
There is no ceasefire for these Kurdish refugees fleeing the north of Syria. With fighting still raging between Turkish and Kurdish forces, many people are running for safety in Iraq. Kurds who have arrived safely there say the situation in Ras Al Ain is horrific.
The situation is very bad, and it only got worse after Turkey's attack on us. I was here 3 years ago, and I returned to Syria because the situation was good there. If there had not been a Turkish attack, I would not have come here.
In the last couple of days, hundreds of people have arrived at the Berdaj camp near Dohuk in northern Iraq. Humanitarian workers are struggling to cope with the increasing demand.
I can't predict the exact number of people, but there has been a lot of movement. And in the last few days, we have received 1,200 Syrian refugees in Iraq.
Trapped between different advancing armies, Kurdish refugees are struggling to find a safe place to stay. Most of them, however, say they will return to northern Syria once the fighting subdues.
Now to a meeting a day after that, US delegation reached an agreement with Turkey to halt its week-old offensive against Kurdish forces in northern Syria. The US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo is now in Jerusalem holding talks with Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. On the agenda, US-Israeli efforts to counter Iran. Israel has been concerned that Tehran could exploit a US military pullback in Syria. Let's get more with Iris Makler in Jerusalem. Iris, it's not surprising that Iran was very much pivotal to these discussions, was it?
No, Iran has been the focus. I mean, US Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, his views are quite similar to those of Benjamin Netanyahu. And going into the meeting, he was tweeting about calling on the United Nations not to lift its embargo on arms sales to Iran. He said it could lead to a new arms race in the Middle East. Imagine China and Russia both selling state-of-the-art arms to Iran. Imagine what that would do locally. So that was one thing that is a concern of his and that he has been raising at that meeting. But, you know, Washington gives with one hand and it takes with the other. This controversial action in Syria with Turkey has strengthened Turkey, obviously. Moscow has become the regional strong man now in the absence of Washington. But it's also strengthened Assad and Iran. And that's a huge concern for Israel. And so Israel is saying, you know, there's a base, for example, in Western Syria. That's an American base. Could the US keep it there, you know, and keep those 150 American soldiers there so that what we will see will be something that will be a small break on Iran getting arms into Syria. So those are the kinds of issues they will be discussing.
Iris, staying with that American angle, the Kurds we know have been long-term allies of the US. How is this apparent betrayal of the Kurds resonating throughout Israel?
It is a concern here, and in fact, this you could even say was a reassurance mission. That's why Mike Pompeo is here. I heard some Israelis saying bitterly, what will happen when Donald Trump figures out that Israel wasn't at Normandy either? So there is a concern that now it looks like America could be betraying its allies, and that could include Israel. You know, they look here at Donald Trump's reaction to Iran's attack in September on the Saudi oil sites, and they think, well, he didn't help them. Why is he going to help us if we're attacked? And that's a real issue. I've heard right-wing critics of Benjamin Netanyahu is taking a lot of flack for this, by the way. I've heard right-wing critics and left-wing critics saying he put all his eggs in one basket. He put his eggs in the Trump basket, and that's dangerous for Israel.
And of course, that withdrawal of US troops, not just sending a message to American allies in Israel, but across the region. Iris Makler there, keeping a very close eye on that meeting in Jerusalem for us. Now, Alicia Alonso, the legendary Cuban dancer, has passed away at the age of 98. Despite being nearly blind, the revered ballerina and choreographer won worldwide acclaim for her interpretation of both classical and modern ballet. Alonso was also a friend of Fidel Castro's and with his support established the National Ballet of Cuba.
Speed, strength and dramatic flourish. Alicia Alonso's ascension into the pantheon of ballet's all-time greats came in 1943, when she made her debut in the title role of Giselle, performing it while partially blind. 2 years earlier, her eyesight had started to deteriorate, so Alonso learnt the steps in her head and with her hands. On stage, she was guided by whispers from her partner and the stage lights. She became the first dancer from outside the European continent to gain international renown. But her career also attracted controversy. Alonso made a historic guest appearance in the Soviet Union at the height of the Cold War. And she was also a friend of Fidel Castro.
He's a brave, intelligent, and a very human man. And he's an example for all of us.
When Castro's government took power in 1959, he funded Alonso's dance troupe, which was renamed the National Ballet of Cuba. As diplomatic tensions eased, it toured the world, making it one of the country's greatest cultural exports. Alonso continued to dance into her 70s and goes down in history as a prima ballerina assoluta, a title reserved for ballet's once-in-a-generation legends. Although she never regained her sight, her vision lives on in the National Ballet of Cuba and its ballet school, the world's largest.
A reminder now of the top news stories at this hour on France 24. Former Catalan leader Carles Puigdemont hands himself into Belgian authorities after Spain issued a new warrant for his arrest. Catalonia, meanwhile, braces itself for a fifth day of protests over the conviction of a dozen Catalan independence leaders. Plus, the EU and Britain reach a deal. Boris Johnson now begins an intensive campaign to garner support ahead of a Saturday vote by lawmakers in the UK.